resilience, knowledge to counter this kind of nexus between the energy, climate change, and the security in the region. Mr. Artan, please join us. So we will give each panelist, we will give a matter of time to discuss his view on regarding the region. And for those who are not, for those who do not have a background on international relations, law, or social science, Horn of Africa is one of the strategic places in the world where from the economic sector, or trade sector, where the entire shipping line or supply chain from the Asia, Africa, and Europe just crossing on the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb, where Somaliland is occupied 840 miles as a de facto state subsequently after the collapse of the Somali Republic in 1991. Without further ado, I will start with the first presentation on Philip, and then we will go with Artan, and we will also give the last to the Excellency Ambassador Ableta, and then we will come up with the guiding questions, and then I will open the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, just bear in us. Please switch off your mobile phones, stop moving chairs, and just let's have a very polite and as well as a very professional participant in this panel. Thank you very much for. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have to be a bit of a rebellious panelist right away. So I would suggest that I actually is going to be the last presentation, as I'm going to focus on the Gulf states' involvement in the region. And as I understand, and we talked about before, my co-panelists, they will shed a bit of a broader picture on the strategic relevance of the region. So before we zoom in on the GCC, maybe it makes sense to sort of look at the broader picture, if I may.
Okay, so actually Philip and I had a conference call a couple of days ago. We agreed on what we just had. Now, the topic that we are going to discuss today here has a huge history. The region, the Horn of Africa, where the Red Sea is located at. There has been wars and everything else that's going on. In terms of the climate change and the impact it had. Thank you. Okay. In terms of the climate change and the security, there's an underlying fundamental that goes in the bed, right? And that's the economics, right? So I just want to give you a quick number. There are the Chinese, for example, and the developed countries, including the United States, are the top polluters in the world. Just a quick number, 5 million metric ton, where the Chinese are 10 million per hectare ton. Now, in Africa, and more specifically in the Horn, the impact is much greater, though we did not really reap the benefit of that pollution side of things. We did not create it, nor, but we are on the receiving end of the things. So what I will try to do in my 10-minute session is to actually look at the broader perspective of the policies and see if I can actually recommend some policies from the African side, from the East African, and more specifically Somaliland, where I'm from, right? So there, since after World War II, the shift has changed, where the powers of the world have changed drastically. Fast forward to 1991, when the Soviet empire collapsed, the powers, both the West, Warsaw and NATO, were shifting towards the routes of commerce. And the most strategic commerce lane or route is Bab el-Mandeb, where the Red Sea is actually located at. Now, the
importance of that is 65% of the commerce goes through this region. So if somebody just plays around with it, you can actually analyze and you can see the issues that comes with it, right? So that's how important the Red Sea is and where we're located at. There has been a lot of wars going on and a lot of issues going on. Yemen, right? Ethiopia, which the ambassador will talk about a little bit more in detail on his end, and the latest Sudan, right? All this instability impacts us, and it also makes the region more important when it comes to the economic side of things. I always like to say, people don't just fight; they fight for a reason. Governments don't fight, right? They fight also for a reason. This is strategic resources, right? That's, economics, everything goes with that. So how can we actually combat climate change and also come with an idea that we can hold and sustain security that, again, goes back into the resources that we have? I've been in the energy sector for over 11 years, and I will say that we are one of the polluters, right? I was on that side of the industry of the world. But the fact is, fossil fuels, really, whether it's coal or natural gas or oil, brought us where we are today in terms of development. If there were no coal, for example, the U.S. wouldn't be built. It is infrastructure. Same thing. So how can we change that? Okay, because now we know that the coal is very problematic because of its carbon issues that it pollutes. It's the highest. So as the fossil fuels. How can we reap the benefit that the developed countries already did? By using cheap resources, fossil fuels cheaper than renewables as we stand. How can we reap the benefits without really contributing more into the climate change? That's the biggest question out there. And also, how this strategic, and there's a lot of talk and discussions on how the underdeveloped or developing countries, just like the ones we are here in the region, can take the advantage of the capital that's being invested by the developed countries, who actually create all the pollution, as I mentioned earlier. Should we go in the direction where it's like handouts, some sort of aid, for example? Say, okay, let's put this here. Let's give millions and billions of dollars to these countries in a horn, all right? And see what comes out of it, just like has been happening the last 50, 60, 80 years, to be honest with you. Or should there be another approach where you invest in the countries in a form of capital, right, and have a resource base that is an investment, right, rate of return, ROI, right? The good thing of that is you're not only giving an opportunity to the people to live, right, but you are creating value. You are creating value, which is going to be a contributor to both the security and it will reduce the climate impact. So we can discuss on that in a more formal way, right, and share my ideas. So I don't want to take all the time, so I'll yield back to the ambassador.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back after a couple of years. Actually, the last time I was here was in 2017 to discuss with the President on how best one can frame Somaliland's quest for independence. I was was in Hargeisa as Ethiopia's representative from 2002 until 2006. I had a very good experience. I was a very young man, as you can imagine, and it was also a good thing and a liability at the same time. To be young, you will be energetic, you will be everywhere, and the leadership at that time was a very veteran politician, President Igal, who always reminds me, young man, you have to learn. So you not only try to explain what your government thinks, but you have to tell him that he has to deal with me, even if I am young. So that dilemma had impacted the way I engaged with Somaliland. I've been in the processes, the transitions of power from Leti Gal to President Reale, his elections. So it's actually very good to be back. I think I want to congratulate Somaliland. They have achieved a lot. Hargeisa of 2002 and Hargeisa of 2023 are completely different. A lot of infrastructural developments. I miss this place, frankly, because my youngest career time I was here. Because of limited time, I could have shared a lot of my experiences in Hargeisa, but let me stop here and go back to the topic at hand. The significance of the Horn on global power rivalry is a topic that I was asked to comment on. I think there are three fundamental issues that we have to understand about the Horn. The Horn is situated at a very strategic position, actually a choke point where global trade is moving in between. 40% of Europe's trade with Asia is conducted through the Red Sea. The other one is access to markets. The whole of Africa holds hundreds and millions of people. It's a big market. So there is that makes the region a very strategic area. The other one is resource potential. People talk of the Horn being a place, a region with poverty, hunger, drought, desertification, etc., etc. But there are others who see the potential of the Horn. The Horn's potential is huge, from hydrocarbon, hydroelectricity generation, rivers, agricultural land. I still remember a Kenyan journalist who said, of course the Gulf will interfere in the Horn of Africa because you guys, the people of the Horn, are sleeping on the most fertile, rich land which they want to have. Because their resources are limited, it will end sometime, and hence the Gulf now, because of their asymmetric power, huge resources currently, want to tap into the potential of the world. I think one should also look at the interests of great powers, the US, China, even Russia, Turkey to some extent. I think if you look at how BRICS decided to make Ethiopia a member of BRICS this time around, should raise a lot of questions. Because Ethiopia is not necessarily at peace with itself. Ethiopia's economy is not growing at a speed that it used to grow. Ethiopia has to deal with several of its fault lines. But why did BRICS consider Ethiopia to be a member? I believe it's because of the potential, the resources, manpower market. And the Chinese have invested a lot. They want to protect their investments. And because the Chinese have invested in Ethiopia, they want to protect their resources, of course. I see it even as a little sacrifice by the Chinese to protect a backyard of their biggest involvement in Djibouti. In Djibouti, the Chinese have invested, they have built ports. It's a huge market to maintain. It's an entry to African markets. Ethiopia is the headquarters of the African Union. It hosts the UN ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, etc. So one has to look at the potential of the region, even to explain why BRICS decided to have Ethiopia as Turkey is much more market related, but also ideological, competing with Gulf actors. Let me look at the challenge and implication. I think the Horn and the Gulf overall hosts various levels of rivalries. Greater power rivalries, middle power rivalries, rivalries within the states of the Horn as well, and within the states of the Gulf actors. There are security concerns, a lot of fragility in the Horn of Africa, which means possible huge state collapse could drive migration to Europe, the United States, and other areas. Because of that, it is a security concern for many. Sovereignty and influence is another challenge in the great power rivalry. I think the other important thing is related to the Nile waters. As you might know, Ethiopia is building the biggest dam on the Nile waters, which will make Sudan powerful compared to other countries in the Nile River, because it is Sudan that determines how much water goes to Egypt. It is not Ethiopia. Ethiopia has to release the water. You can't keep the water. You have to release the water to produce, generate electricity. So who benefits from a sustained release of water from the Gulf is Sudan. So Sudan fundamentally determines how much water reaches Egypt. That is why developments in Sudan have to be understood from the perspective of those implications on Egypt. As I said earlier, this area has its own potential, huge potential in every aspect, but it has also its own fault lines. For example, the regional organization called IGAD was established in 1986, was revitalized in 1996, but compared to other regional organizations, it didn't create the institutions, the rules governing interstate relations in the Horn. It becomes a problem. IGAD never discusses about Somaliland, for example, because Somalia is there and Somalia doesn't want. Because of that weaknesses, various weaknesses of IGAD, the region couldn't harness its potential towards having a common position with other interlocutors that are engaging the Horn of Africa. I don't know how many minutes I have, but I have to conclude. In general, I think if the Horn countries discuss, engage, the biggest challenge for me is communication. People do not communicate. We don't know Hargeisa. As a person who has lived here, when I explain to them what Hargeisa is, what the politics of Somaliland is, people just don't understand me. The same is true for Somalilanders who follow Ethiopia. The communication between the people is lacking. People-to-people relations is weak. They don't force shape political decisions in governance structures. I think if one could look at a possibility of a popular engagement in the Horn of Africa, probably one can shape the way governments behave in the Horn, so that the Horn will not be a victim in greater power rivalry that will be emerging. I personally have followed this very seriously. For example, in Somalia, you will see the Chinese have no space. In Somaliland, the Taiwanese are there, they say. What does this mean if Ethiopia is a member of the BRICS and Somaliland continues to engage with Taiwan? What happens if Ethiopia is being supported by BRICS and Somalia government needs support from Ethiopia to address challenge of Al-Shabaab? How would the Chinese and the Americans look at this? So, big power rivalry has implications on everybody's life in the Horn of Africa. As you know, in the during the Cold War, the biggest competition between great powers ended up in the Ogaden, in the Somali region of Ethiopia. So we'll continue to be entrapped into that. So people in the Horn of Africa must engage, must talk to each other and see how they can impact their governments to think differently than what they have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I hope this will work like that. All right, thank you very much. So after having been given the first word, then I'll also attempt to sort of conclude and focus the conclusion, at least of the first rounds of intervention of this panel on the Gulf states' engagement in the Gulf. So, as was introduced, I'm the director of the regional program Gulf States. I think this is giving some feedback. I'm putting this away. Of the regional program Gulf States of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, meaning we focus our work on the GCC and other states, Yemen, Iran, of the Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula. And so what I want to attempt today is to focus a little bit on the Gulf states as actors here in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, due to the strategic importance that my co-panelists have outlined quite well before me. And the first thing I would like to do is to sort of explain a little bit the rationale behind it and the calculus behind it for the GCC states to be engaging in this region. Besides the obvious relevance of the Horn of Africa, there are strong calculations also from a state's perspective from the Gulf. I'm going to focus mainly on 3 Gulf states in the remainder of this input because they are the most relevant players here in the region, that is the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and also Qatar. So for all these states, there's an overarching impetus to preserve and consolidate the state and the state's authority and its regional role for an own survival calculus. So the Gulf states have an interest in shoring up and strengthening their own state's authority, both internally and regionally. And as we're looking at regional phenomena, I'm going to focus on the latter. Regional meaning going through 2 basic instruments or 2 basic alleys conducive to these interests. The Gulf states have an overarching goal of supporting and accelerating their economic diversification, and therefore want to engage economically and globally stronger, and they have an overarching interest also in preserving their own states from importing insecurity from the immediate and the wider region, and also to strengthen and diversify their international partnerships and alliances. And what you can see is that over the course of the past 15 to 20 years, the Gulf states have become from reactive players in these regards to more proactive players. Overall, the instruments they have engaged with in the beginning were mainly security interventions in a reactive manner. First and foremost, to insulate themselves, as I said before, from importing regional insecurity or instability. But they have gone, as they went, to more proactive means of engagement, more towards a tool that an American scholar that some of you might be familiar with, Karen Young, has called economic statecraft. So the employment of economic means in order to achieve foreign policy goals. So as we look at the events unfolding since the so-called Arab uprising or Arab Spring, the Gulf states have first engaged in their immediate vicinity in Bahrain and in Oman with security intervention in order to counter some of the, as they perceived at least, instability evolving in those countries and to preserve their own countries from importing that instability. And then as they moved forward with their engagement in Egypt after 2012, 2013, have employed increasingly economic statecraft means, for instance, by shoring up the Egyptian state, by strengthening the position of the Egyptian central bank, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that security intervention has not featured heavily still in the foreign policy toolkit. So if we look at Yemen post-2015, we see that security intervention has still played a major role in the Gulf states' calculus. But as I said, as they came from sort of more reactive engagement, and I would regard Yemen as a more reactive engagement to more proactive, they also put a higher emphasis on their economic statecraft needs. And for the Horn of Africa and for this region, it is precisely the latter, the economic statecraft engagement, the more proactive engagement of the Gulf states that has been important, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that there has been also a quite significant military and security footprint here in the Horn of Africa. So why are the Gulf states doing this? How are the Gulf states doing this, and what are the specific means on how they are engaging here in the region? So, as I said, in terms of diversifying the economy, securing also their economic transformation, one of the overarching goals has been market access and food security. The Gulf states have heavily invested in land, for instance in Ethiopia, but also in Somalia, with their agri-investments trying to insulate themselves from food crises that have plagued the Gulf states and their food imports in the past. And going forward, the calculus behind that is also to reap greater return on investment from these investments in agricultural businesses and in land. Investment is the keyword also for the second major alley of engagement of the Gulf states here. So there has been, besides the more sort of economically motivated investments in the region, a significant influx of development assistance also from the Gulf. The GCC states, they usually regard both as sort of two sides of the same coin, so they are employed for political means and they're employed in sync, but there has been a strategic and a significant influx of ODA, of overseas development assistance, official overseas development assistance from the Gulf states into the region, with main targets being first and foremost also Ethiopia and Somalia. The investments that I've named, and this is the third major alley, have gone into strategic infrastructure, especially port infrastructure in the region. This is a significant factor for the UAE's engagement here in the region, as the United Arab Emirates are building their so-called string of pearls strategy, their specific string of strategically located ports throughout the entire region. And again, this being conducive to their overarching economic goals, the UAE trying to position themselves, or are successfully positioned themselves as a global hub for logistics, for trade, for connectivity. And so they have also invested heavily in port infrastructure here in the Horn of Africa. So after having been given the first word, then I'll also attempt to sort of conclude and focus the conclusion, at least of the first rounds of intervention of this panel on the Gulf states engagement in the Gulf. So, as was introduced, I'm the director of the regional program Gulf States. This is giving some feedback. I'm putting this away. Of the regional program Gulf states of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, meaning we focus our work on the GCC and other states, Yemen, Iran, of the Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula. And so what I want to attempt today is to focus a little bit on the Gulf states as actors here in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa, due to the strategic importance that my co-panelists have outlined quite well before me. And the first thing I would like to do is to sort of explain a little bit the rationale behind it and the calculus behind it for the GCC states to be engaging in this region. Besides the obvious relevance of the Horn of Africa, there are strong calculations also from a state's perspective from the Gulf. I'm going to focus mainly on 3 Gulf states in the remainder of this input because they are the most relevant players here in the region. That is the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and also Qatar. So for all these states, there's an overarching impetus to preserve and consolidate the state and the state's authority and its regional role for an own survival calculus. So the Gulf states have an interest in shoring up and strengthening their own state's authority both internally and regionally. And as we're looking at regional phenomena, I'm going to focus on the latter. Regional meaning going through 2 basic instruments or 2 basic alleys conducive to these interests. Gulf states have an overarching goal of supporting and accelerating their economic diversification and therefore want to engage economically and globally stronger, and they have an overarching interest also in preserving their own states from importing insecurity from the immediate and the wider region, and also to strengthen and diversify their international partnerships and alliances. And what you can see is that over the course of the past 15 to 20 years, the Gulf states have become from reactive players in these regards to more proactive players. Overall, the instruments they have engaged with in the beginning were mainly security interventions in a reactive manner, first and foremost to insulate themselves, as I said before, from importing regional insecurity or instability. But they have gone, as they went, to more proactive means of engagement, more towards a tool that an American scholar that some of you might be familiar with, Karen Young, has called economic statecraft. So the employment of economic means in order to achieve foreign policy goals. So as we look at the events unfolding since the so-called Arab uprising or Arab Spring, the Gulf states have first engaged in their immediate vicinity in Bahrain and in Oman with security intervention in order to counter some of the, as they perceived at least, instability evolving in those countries and to preserve their own countries from importing that instability. And then as they moved forward with their engagement in Egypt after 2012, 2013, have employed increasingly economic statecraft means. For instance, by shoring up the Egyptian state, by strengthening the position of the Egyptian central bank, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that security intervention has not featured heavily still in the foreign policy toolkit. So if we look at Yemen post-2015, we see that security intervention has still played a major role in the Gulf states calculus. But as I said, as they came from sort of more reactive engagement, and I would regard Yemen as a more reactive engagement to more proactive, they also put a higher emphasis on their economic statecraft means. And for the Horn of Africa and for this region, it's precisely the latter, the economic statecraft engagement, the more proactive engagement of the Gulf states that has been important, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that there has been also a quite significant military and security footprint here in the Horn of Africa. So why are the Gulf states doing this? How are the Gulf states doing this, and what are the specific means on how they are engaging here in the region? So, as I said, in terms of diversifying the economy, securing also their economic transformation, one of the overarching goals has been market access and food security. The Gulf states have heavily invested in
land, for instance, in Ethiopia, but also in Somalia, with their agri-investments trying to insulate themselves from food crises that have plagued the Gulf states and their food imports in the past. And going forward, the calculus behind that is also to reap greater return on investment from these investments in agricultural businesses and in land. Investment is the keyword also for the second major alley of engagement of the Gulf states here. So there has been, besides the more sort of economically motivated investments in the region, a significant influx of development assistance also from the Gulf. The GCC states, they usually regard both as sort of two sides of the same coin, so they are employed for political means and they're employed in sync, but there has been a strategic and a significant influx of ODA, of overseas development assistance, official overseas development assistance from the Gulf states into the region, with main targets being first and foremost also Ethiopia and Somalia. The investments that I've named, and this is the third major alley, have gone into strategic infrastructure, especially port infrastructure in the region. This is a significant factor for the UAE's engagement here in the region, as the United Arab Emirates are building their so-called string of pearls strategy, their specific string of strategically located ports throughout the entire region. And again, this being conducive to their overarching economic goals, the UAE trying to position themselves, or already successfully positioned themselves, as a global hub for logistics, for trade, for connectivity. And so they have also invested heavily in port infrastructure here in the Horn of Africa, and as you are all aware of course, also quite significantly here in Berbera, in Somaliland, both as an alternative to other ports in the region, but also due to the frustration and the problems that Emirati investments had in neighboring Djibouti with their DP World engagement there in the port. And then the last major way how the Gulf states engage here in the region is, or sort of the red thread that runs through their engagement here in the region, is to secure their international outreach. So as I said, main foreign policy goals for the Gulf states are shoring up international alliances, of strongly positioning themselves regionally, so countering their regional rivals here in the Horn of Africa as well has been one of the major concerns of those three states that I mentioned, and some of these rivals of course include some of themselves as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later. This is by building bases, by building again strategically important infrastructure, and then using of course the nodes that they have established here in the Horn of Africa also for their wider regional engagement, first and foremost using bases here in the Horn of Africa as staging grounds for the campaign and their military engagement in Yemen. So coming to the third and last part of my short input, I want to sort of look at the implications that this has to the region, and an outlook and an assessment also coming from a German, from a European perspective, looking at that engagement. What does that type of involvement of Qatar, of the UAE, and of Saudi Arabia here in the region mean for the Horn of Africa? So I think one of the important implications that it has is that as the Gulf states conduct their foreign policy, it is always in a highly transactional, personalized way of conducting foreign policy. So a lot of these engagements, for instance, looking towards Ethiopia, but then also looking here at Somaliland, they're built on the personal rapport of Gulf states leaders that they have with political representatives here from the region. And so as they are so highly personalized, of course, there's also always the risk of them changing, relationships souring, or as personal changes also, maybe less so on the Gulf side and more so on the African side, then also those relationships, as they are poorly institutionalized, can change. So this is the first sort of conclusion looking towards what this means for the region. The second is, and this has been named by the ambassador before, is that of course as the Gulf states conduct their engagement in the Horn of Africa in sort of this wider framework that I've outlined before, and with the explicit goal of countering their regional rivals, it means that the Horn of Africa also imports some of those rivalries and conflicts from the Gulf and the wider region into their regional dynamics. This has featured firstly when the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with their engagement, tried to counter Iran here in the region, in Eritrea and in Sudan. It has then culminated with the Qatar blockade, and Qatar on the one hand and the UAE on the other countering themselves here in the region. Of course, that had specific and strong implications for Somalia and Somaliland, with Qatar and the UAE respectively aligning with the two parts of the federal state, or the federal state and Somaliland. And it also will, and this has been alluded to, I think, in the opening words today by the keynote speaker, there's also evolving rivalries that this region has to look at, because they will import that rivalry through the Gulf states engagement between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So both countries, in their economic diversification endeavors, have an increased competition. If you look at other regional theaters, Yemen, of course, but then also recently Sudan are at loggerheads when it comes to their regional engagement, and this can also play out with Saudi Arabia's and the UAE's involvement here in the Horn of Africa. So concluding, and as a representative of a German organization, of course, always looking at implications for Germany and Europe, what does it mean from a European perspective? I think it's safe to say that Europe does not feature heavily, or maybe not as heavily at least, as other international actors here in the region. Our political clout certainly is not as significant as it is from the American side, the Chinese side, the Gulf states, as I've outlined before. However, I think we have certain competitive advantages that we can utilize in engaging with these sort of larger geostrategic region dynamics that my co-panelists have outlined before. First, Germany still is, of course, well regarded as a power that can play out its diplomatic weight, that can foster negotiation, that can foster regional platforms. And so I think, with these dynamics that I've just outlined, this is an important advantage that Germany could play out in negotiating, for instance, in some of the open conflicts in the region, and also with some of the evolving rivalries between regional actors. And the second is that Germany and Europe are both major sources of international developmental assistance, as are the Gulf states, and as the Gulf states are using them here in the region, as I've outlined before, I think there's a greater potential to coordinate and to synchronize maybe our developmental engagement from the European side with that of the Gulf states here in the region. The EU has published a strategic partnership communique last year on its engagement with the Gulf states, and one of the pillars in there was to align more with the developmental assistance coming from the Gulf, and I think the Horn of Africa is a major region where that could be done, and where there's potential also for Germany and Europe to come into these regional dynamics. And with that, I want to conclude. Thank you very much, and over back to the chair.
Thank you very much for all of you for such a kind of timely summary. I would like to dive in some questions from the panelists, and then I will give the floor to the participants to ask questions. First question is to Arthur, who is a very well-known specialty on oil and as well as energy sector. The question goes to how do African states minimize the impact of oil drilling into the climate change and while they maximizing their energy transition. And this is something to do with most of the Horn of African countries, the lack of energy, and they get their oil from Arab countries for most of the time, while some countries are continuing to drill. The next year they are planning to drill oil in such countries as Somalia. So the question is how to minimize the impact that those kind of oil drilling will likely the climate change as well as the environmental hazards while maximizing the benefits for it. What are the lessons learned can be learned from the past experience?
Thank you. That's a good question. So when we say energy, the last 100 years, right, when the industrialized industry came into the picture, 1930s, right, before World War I, energy has been the bedrock of, building a sustainable economy, which the developed countries, what we call, whether it's now Chinese became also developed, but mainly the West, has been relying on fossil fuels, whether it's coal, oil, or natural gas lately. That caused an issue, what we are discussing today, mainly the climate change, because of the carbon dioxide that has been being released into the atmosphere. Big issue, right? The seas will be rising and all of that. But the other part is that Africans, and more specifically in the Horn, we didn't take advantage of that development. We need to develop ourselves. And everybody, the discussion, I think, we should really include in, okay, how can we drill, but at the same time capture the carbon dioxide? Do we even need to drill oil more? I think we need, fossil fuels will be here, specifically more when it comes to natural gas and so forth. But how do we compact needs a policy framework that needs attraction. Investment in general, we're not going in the direction into the oil companies anymore or fossil fuel companies. And the reason is that because there's a discussion where, as I said, they want to compact climate change. Climate change is going to be a problem, but lack of economics will be also a problem, right? The renewables is where we are also going. The renewables need batteries and energy storage. The minerals that we use for energy storage mainly comes from this region as well. A lot of it, copper, right? All of that actually will be collected. So that's why the Horn of Africa and Africa in general will be a playing ground for the years and centuries to come in order to be that energy transition side of things. There is a huge benefit that will come into this region. That's why politically, what Ambassador talked about is finding a win-win situation. We have to talk to each other, right? I don't see it necessary right now to build, to produce oil in the region. I don't see that necessity because you really need to build an infrastructure, right? Number one. Number two, you really need to have some sort of export side of things and find the markets. So that's why we already have the GCC, and doing that, can we actually capitalize on drilling natural resources such as minerals in order to help with the energy transition side of things? Can we actually come up with policies like that? I think we can, and we can position ourselves instead of positioning the GCC's type of economics. We can position the Horn of Africa, a place where if you are building solar panels, if you are actually having energy storage or lithium batteries, this is the place to find those resources and invest us in that. I think we can frame that. And if we want to supplement that, we can drill the natural gas, which is a lot less in terms of pollution, greener than oil. So I wouldn't recommend going into the oil side of things because we really need to move away from that. Although, as I said, economically, we didn't take the benefit. We didn't get the benefit as the developed countries really had previously. So that's why I recommended earlier, and I have nothing against the NGOs and such, the last 80 years, I should say, there were a lot of capital, and we had this relationship from the West pouring into Africa, and more specifically into this region, solely so that they can develop, and really nice of them.
but that hasn't really produced anything. That really didn't produce anything that's tangible that I can put my fingers to it. People are still starving, right? There's no economics that works. So the question becomes, how can we change our approach? Okay, we're still putting the capital in. Should we, think about a way that we can invest in these energy transitions and creating these industries so that the investment can be sustainable in the long term, right? If the EU, thanks to them, the US aids and all of these other investors, actually I shouldn't say investors, donators, which is the tax monies, dollars, are coming here, how can we change our approach, right? And I think the impact will change. The Chinese took that approach. That's why a lot of capital, and I think the way that they were doing were not the right way, so to speak, because their dollars, though they were building bridges and ports and such, but the rate of return that they're looking for can really cripple the economy of the country at the end of the day, right? So that's detrimental to the African countries. So I think that region should really talk, right, as our master said, and each country should talk to each other, right? And by framing a policy that's a win-win situation for everyone.
Thank you very much. As the panelist was discussing different kind of directions when it comes to those external relations in Horn of Africa, from Gulf to Europe, and as well as those one of the Asian powers who now build different kind of infrastructure. As we speak, China, their initiative in Horn of Africa, where it starts in Djibouti, where China has built its military base in Djibouti. And there has been a sort of a worrying signals from the previous ambassadors or previous academics in the Horn of Africa, where they argue that the great power or Gulf rivalry in the region or the emerging power in the region will contribute to more conflict in Horn of Africa rather than the stability. So my question to the Ambassador Abdetta is, how do the African or how do the Horn of African states capture the maximum benefit for the rivalry and minimize the impact of the rivalry to begin? And what is the experience from the Ethiopian perspective?
Thank you for this is a very good question. I think managing your strategic rivalry in the Horn needs diplomatic finesse, planning, strategic planning. But I can raise a couple of points that can help the region address some of the challenges. One is maintaining neutrality. If the Horn countries, governments engage, discuss, and become neutral on the positions of great power rivalry, that helps. Taking a position means the other, you will invite a reaction from the other side. So maintaining one neutrality is critical. The other one is strengthening the regional organizations, such as IGAD. As I said earlier, IGAD is very weak, but it can be really vitalized if the governments really want to make it a better organization. So strengthening regional organizations, either the East African community, in which everybody joins, or even IGAD, the African Union as well. Strengthening regional organizations will help countries of the Horn of Africa address some of the challenges of big power rivalry. I think the other one is diversifying partnerships. Have a relationship with each actor on the basis of a comparative advantage that one has. look, Russian guns are cheaper than American ones. If you buy the guns from Russia and buy the technology for your agriculture, high-tech industries from America, both have interests they will maintain. So diversifying partnership. Look, whether the West likes or not, China has money now. In fact, African countries have to compete on how to get Chinese money and investment into. China has to transition to a tertiary level of industrialization in the service sectors. So it has to remove obsolete technologies that produce clothes and others, and move into other sophisticated industries. Where do they take it? The easiest area is Africa. So African countries have to compete. So it is not a question of whether we want it or not, but it's a natural flow of economics and investment. So diversifying partnerships helps. The other one is ensuring economic integration. When I was here, for example, I was trying to convince the Ethiopians that bringing cargoes through Berbera port is possible, is doable. People say there is no banking service and there is no international trade rules that you can demand, etc., etc. But if you take a risk as well, but you can use. When I was here, I was able to convince the Ethiopian government to import some of its cargoes. But as the cars, the heavy trucks were so dangerous for the roads, we couldn't continue. So the roads, the infrastructures have to be invested in, of course. I think the other one is engaging in diplomatic dialogue. Explain to the West what we think of our involvement in China, with China and with others. So engaging diplomatically calms down pressures. I think balancing security cooperation is necessary. If the whole can cooperate with both sides on common security issues, countering terrorism could be one, addressing piracy could be another one. I think a balanced security cooperation approach can help. The other one is confidence building measures. You need to create confidence with both parties. At the same time, of course, I'm not naive. There are red lines that the West indicates for it. For example, with respect to Ukraine, they don't want any African country to have a different view on that. But I also tell my Western colleagues, look, we are, after all, at the recipient end of the Ukraine crisis. International global prices have gone up. Basic commodities, access to wheat and food has become difficult. International oil prices have gone up. So we Africans are at the recipient end. It's your war, but the implication has on us, impacting a recovery economy from COVID. So, but it is good to engage, as I said earlier. The other one is mediation efforts. Try to mediate between different actors, because internal cohesion in the region is critically important. For example, Somaliland was considered seriously by the international community for being exercising democracy better than others in the region and maintaining peace and security. I think Somalilanders have to sacrifice to ensure that those two issues are not touched. If you create fault lines within yourself, they will say, oh, the usual Somalis. So I think Somalilanders have to be very, very clever in ensuring that they deal with issues either within the politics, within the elites, or even in Lasano through peaceful means. I think that is very, very critical in my view. the war will damage Somaliland more than anybody else. I was telling my colleagues yesterday, even if you explain the reason to the West, they will not listen to you. Because it is the outcome that is seen. And especially with social media taking over issues, issues are daily. Nobody goes back and explains and looks for the details of what happened in Lasan or how the war came. People are going to say, you are shooting while we are trying to support you here and there. So it is always good to look at mediation and conflict resolution. I think creating regional infrastructural projects, connectivity is very, very critical in the Horn of Africa if we have to deal with the challenge of big power rivalry. I can tell you frankly that Ethiopia next year will have enough energy to share because its capacity to distribute internally is still weak. So if one connects Somaliland with Ethiopian electricity, Djibouti is already connected, Kenya is already connected, probably Sudan is already connected, even if it is in civil war. So peace and stability in Ethiopia becomes a concern to all of the Horn of African countries. So they will work together. I think the other important issue is in the Horn of Africa to put someone to put oneself into someone's boots and understand the concerns of the other side, safeguarding the concerns of the others. What is driving Hargeisa when Abiy says, okay, I have to bring at that time Farmajo, now probably Hassan Sheikh and Musa Bihi together? Why there is a difficulty? There is always a necessity on the part of the Ethiopian government to understand why people avoid that and chart a better mechanism of engaging with both in that regard. So it is creating these safety nets whereby one understands the problem of the other in making peace and stability. For example, you asked me what was Ethiopia's experience in dealing with big power rivalry. The last 5 years, it's difficult to comment, honestly. I'm not part of it, so I would rather comment on the previous regime's strategies. As I indicated earlier, make yourself relevant to both. The Americans want countering terrorism and addressing challenge of peace and security in the Horn, so you have enough peacekeeping force to deploy. You become relevant to them. The Chinese want investment. They want to move their technologies elsewhere, obsolete technologies. You avail that. So it is how you engage with both on the basis of their interests. I think understanding the red lines is important, although they can always shift the goalposts. Understanding the red lines of the other actors is always important. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and you cover all the things. Let me, before I give the floor to the audience, let me ask Philip as well, how do the developing status economy engagement in the Horn of Africa is different from economy engagement from Turkey, from China, or from the other external powers in the region?
I'm not sure if there are actually that much difference, so maybe I think that ought to be the question, the answer to the question. I think what is important to understand is how the Gulf sees itself strategically positioned in the region and what this means for the economic diversification endeavors that you've seen with Vision 2030 or in Saudi Arabia and the different other visions that you have in practically all the Gulf states. And that is that it sees itself as a hub, as a bridge between Europe, the West, and Asia. And so I think, there's a lot of strategic alignment with also how the Horn of Africa is positioned. I mean, you share the same neighborhood, so obviously, in geostrategic, geo-economic terms, the outlook would be similar henceforth. But I think this is the main calculus, and this is the overarching goal for the Gulf states that are engaged here in the Horn of Africa. And first and foremost, because they are, I would say, the most significant actor from the Gulf here in the region for the United Arab Emirates. The way that not only Dubai with its real estate fueled diversification project, but generally now more centrally steered from Abu Dhabi, is trying to position itself economically. The overarching theme for that economic project or for those economic goals is connectivity. So it sees itself, and it has the infrastructure, and it has a head start also compared with the rest of the region, and frankly also some of the other actors that are coming in here, because it has done that probably a decade earlier than everyone else in the region. And if you look at the global significance that a port like Jebel Ali has these days, this really speaks to how much eggs the United Arab Emirates have placed in that basket. And so I think that is what really drives the economic engagement of the Gulf states here in the Horn of Africa. Now, is that different from, say, Turkey's involvement or China's involvement? I wouldn't think so necessarily, because looking at the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, and Bab el-Mandab, I mean, my co-panelists have outlined this before. If you look at the share of world trade that runs through these maritime sea routes, obviously also here trade, logistics, connectivity is the overarching theme, and so also China's main goal, Turkey's main goal, and other outside powers coming in will necessarily lie on that factor. But I think it is really important to understand how much the Gulf has emphasized this in their economic diversification strategies. Now, dynamics are shifting a little bit, especially between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with Saudi trying to replicate a lot of these, this economic emphasis that the UAE has been somewhat of a first mover on. But it will be driving the engagement. I think that's what really, singles out maybe at least signifies the Gulf states' engagement here. It is really about that connectivity and further capitalizing on the first mover advantage that the United Arab Emirates have.
If I may, I just want to add one thing. It's really important to understand the interest of the GCC, right, in terms of this region. Do they, the Emirates and the Saudis, do they really want this region to be developed and become a prosperous region? I would say yes, but the reality is, they are in oil and gas producing countries. So that's how they actually made their money, and that's how their economics work. Thanks to them, thanks to the Emirates, they built a port for us in Berbera, here in Somaliland. But the additives of that port did not really come with it. So I always ask myself, is that port there just for the sake of being there, right? Did the Somaliland government didn't really work with their counterparts in the region to make something out of that port? Or did the UAE just wanted to hold the Horn of Africa just the way it is right now, but by being the only one who serves the region, right? Because what comes with the port is infrastructure, skills, a lot of huge capital that should come with it. But my understanding, maybe I could be, my thought is that we should push for a more, I would say, strategic engagement with the Gulf, right? By helping the energy transition, which will create all these industries. And the GCCs don't have the resources we have here. That's a basic fact. So how can we get all of these World Bank funds and the UN chartered funding towards and China the right way by building this infrastructure? So if the GCC comes in and wants to invest in us as well, right, we can set the terms. But that really needs more strategic on the policymaking side of it in this region to collaborate more and to actually see why for example, the GCC doesn't see the interest in there, because everything will move away if Port of Berbera becomes a hub, and we are strategically in geography the hub. Everything will move away from Dubai. Is that good for Dubai economics? If I were the Sheikh bin Zayed or the president of the UAE, I would say, no, it's not a good idea. So that's why we have to think in that perspective as well.
I think something to do with also the Great Powers competition and how the Gulf states are one aligned on another. And when it comes to the United Arab Emirates, which is close to the United States, having a DP world in Berbera is also something to do with the American interest in the region, contrabalance, the BRI initiative in North Africa. Just to say, at least when China mediated between the Saudi Arabia and Iran, 1 week later, the government of the United Arab Emirates has come to North Africa in Addis Ababa to advance its interest in the North Africa, especially in the logistics sector, to controversize the China in Djibouti and has a great say to its ability to use that. So this is something to do with the level of analysis on global level and text to the art and for bringing this up. So I will give you the microphone and you can ask where you're from. For those in Somaliland, I will barely give you the microphone because we have a real guest from the neighboring countries. And then please summarize where you're from and your question. I will start with the hand, then the
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Anja Loretta. I'm head of the regional program Energy Security and Climate Change. I just wanted to say a couple of things on the intervention from Artem, especially on the cost of energy. I mean, on paper, renewable energies are cheaper than fossil energies, on paper. Because we do have the situation in Africa that the cost of capital is very high, the perceived risk is very high, and you just don't have the markets. Yeah, the market size is so small. I don't know how much electricity Somaliland consumes. I don't think it's as much as capital of any Western country. So if you ask for foreign investments, it's not attractive because there is not much intake. And so it's kind of a chicken and hen situation because people would like to invest, but then there's no energy, and then the market size is not big enough. So, you know, we have to overcome this logic where people are asking how much energy is there, no, it's not interesting. So it needs to come hand in hand. And I really want to thank the ambassador for making the point of how much importance regional integration plays in this. Because if you don't look at the market of Somaliland, but then on the market of various countries, it becomes more attractive and you can make the business case. And I just want to remember that one implication of the African Free Trade Agreement is also the African single electricity market, and I really do hope that some progress will be made towards that direction, because obviously having a regional grid or an integrated energy market is also a great way of securing stability, because one country then becomes dependent on the other. I also would like to say, as you know, we've discussed the chances and the outlook of oil and coal, and I would definitely say these times are over. Yeah? You have seen obviously of the whole geopolitical situation of the last 1.5 years, a temporary uptake in those resources to assure energy security, especially in Western countries. But this is a short-term development. The medium and long-term development, I think, will take those two energy carriers definitely out of the place. And actually, the nexus between climate and trade is becoming more and more visible. The WTO report from last year actually had the title "Climate Change and International Trade," because you know, banks are pulling out of those investments. The East African crude oil pipeline, everyone has pulled out from the western side. Not because those are good people and they think that climate change is something that needs to be addressed, because the policy frame is there and it's not attractive anymore. It's not a medium, long-term attractive business case to invest in oil and gas, in oil and coal. Sorry. So I think, you know, this is something that has potential for Africa. For me, the answer clearly is no. Gas is another thing, but in the medium to long term, I think we will, you know, seeing this phasing out, probably not as as fast as we were anticipating 5 years ago, but over the medium long term it will phase out. I also wanted to absolutely stress the future importance of critical raw materials for the energy transition. I just want to say that I think there needs to be some vigilance. It's not automatically going to be a win-win situation if not the right policies are put into place. I mean, extractive industries are incredibly harmful for the environment, so this is something that needs to be taken care of. And as we have seen with other raw materials on the African continent, there was not necessarily a win for the broader communities, for the local communities. So if you want to say, this is going to be a game changer, the right policies have to be in place, especially when we talk about creating local value chains that can create job opportunities for the local communities. And I just want to say that some of in some countries where we do have these resources, they are already heavily under control of especially China, and not only the mines but everything, the whole value chain. So if you say, this is going to be a win situation, a game changer for Africa, there needs to be really cohesive and good policies in place, especially in the extractive industries. And I mean, I'm really welcoming this discussion that you're having in Somaliland, because I understand that there's some openness from the policymakers to really take care of that. And a good example that I just want to cite at the end is, the memorandum of understanding between the DRC, Zambia, and the US about creating a free trade area for battery chain and value chains for battery chain in that area. And I think the involvement of the US in countries such as DRC really shows that there's an appetite from international perspective to really invest in value chain. So I hope that Somaliland will also be able to take on this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion. As it is so complex, these issues, I think one thing you really missing, even though the master touched it, is the internal dynamics of the whole region. Issues of the Nile, not only the southern Nile, but also the upper valley countries, and its implications, and also other rivers, because rivers are going to be another conflict-prone issues if we don't be very careful on it. Also, the ports is another conflict that we have to look at. Ethiopia is a very large population, but it's a landlocked. And it has a sea fleet which hasn't got actually a place to stay. Building, the whole, UAE building that fleet, they must have a reason. And the last comment is at least reported from Abiy Ahmed on the issue of they don't get what they use policies of the way. I think it puts more oil into the fire that is already going on. So I think what we have to look at is, I understand that we have to have the understanding of cruciality, but we are far from it. Each country has got its own conflict dynamics that's really creating problems, not giving them chance so that they can look at issues that's really necessary. And then we have also this competition between ourselves. Who is going to take electric votes? Which port is going to be Assad, Canberra, Chibuli, or Mombasa, and I don't know which ones. It doesn't matter. I think Ethiopia can use all these ports because they have a very large population. If they really come up with a very strategic thinking of trying to have that, of balancing between their needs and the availability of these ports, it can easily do, but if you try to see it as a competitive thing, it's not going to work. Infrastructure is a big problem, we understand. Djibouti is the most good place to go now with the train and other ports are coming up. So I think what we have to need, while we have to look at all the Gulf involvement, the BRICS involvement, the Western involvement, we have to also look at within to make the type of cohesion we need to really defend ourselves and have a strategic thinking that benefits for us and our population on the ground, rather than trying to align with this one or that one or that one. I think that's going to be conducive in our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Samuel. I'm from the Center for African and Asian Studies in Southern University. Thank you all for bringing great points, for raising great points. That was very informative. I think I would like to say a few words on issues related to security and economy. I'll be very brief. It's true that security and economic interests will continue to prevail in our region, so as conflicting and cooperative modes of engagement among different member states and state actors shaping our region, particularly internal political dynamics for the best and for the worst. What I would like to touch is with the recent addition of 6 members, particularly almost 5 of them being from our region, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and United Arab Emirates into the BRICS, and tactically, which would mean these countries aligning with the interests of China and the non-allied interests and concerns. How do you see the security and economic implication of this dynamics to the Horn of region, and particularly with Somaliland pushing an agenda of continuously strengthening and reinforcing its engagement with Taiwan? How would this affect its quest for recognition? Thank you.
I think the first two was the recommendation bit of thing, and then we will follow the second question, and then we will come up with the
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. It is already afternoon, I think. My name is Mubarak Abdullahi. Abdulsaq said you have to tell us where are you from. I have different hats. I don't know which one I should tell you.
The Horn of Africa will be enough. So.
Let me appreciate this wonderful conference organized by the APD. And let me say thank you very much for organizing this wonderful conference and bringing all these different expertise from the region and beyond. My question is, as you extensively explained it from different aspects, Horn of Africa is one of the most important regions in the globe. In terms of geostrategy, geopolitics, economic potential, trade, global trade routes, and so on and so on. But we all agreed upon Horn of Africa do not harness or take advantage of its potential, whether it is geopolitical potential or economic potential or else. And I always argue why this is happening is mostly because of our national institutions and regional institutions are either weak or incapacitated. As Ambassador Abeta already explained, there is a necessity to reform the regional institutions we have, like IGAD. So my question is, before we embark on reforming these institutions, we need to understand why our current institutional setup is not delivering the purposes, the objectives we established it for. What are the key factors hindering these institutions to deliver the objectives we established it for? And if we want to reform, what are the key steps that we have to take, coming from your perspective as an ambassador, someone who has better understanding in the regional dynamics? And my second question is, only one question. Okay, I think it's relevant how Somaliland can actually can take advantage of these regional institutions, because Somaliland is not recognized and Somaliland is not on the table. And still, it is very part and parcel in this region, and the healthy, geopolitics and competition. And still we are not on the table. So, are there practical ways you are recommending, to actually to come?
There was two questions. I think the rest was the recommendations. What are the challenges that hinders the regional organizations or country institutions to reflect or to come up with some kind of solution to mitigate rivalities or external powers in the Horn of Africa? And I will open the floor, and you might answer on your perspective.
That's a question.
Let me comment first for my sister who said on port issues, because it's important. Sometimes wrong time, you will find yourself at the wrong time, wrong place. I found myself at the right time when I was here, but this did not feel the pressure of access to the sea at that time. President Igai, late President Igai, very visionary leader, was insisting on Ethiopia to build its own port, its own corridor. He had proposed to the Ethiopian government long time ago. But Ethiopia, being a country that hosts the African Union, the Organization of African Unity at that time, and a member of IGAD, international law-abiding country, etc., because Ethiopia's historical baggage, which is perceived to be engaged in dividing Somalis, so the Ethiopian government was suggesting to President IGAD, you see, it will be difficult for Ethiopia to engage into this strategic engagement of creating a corridor for ourselves. Can you quickly engage with actors in Mogadishu or even convince Djibouti if there is a possibility for you to be recognized? But now the question is being raised in Ethiopia in a different way. As you might know, the last 3 years and a continuous war in the Amhara region now, I don't know when it ends, there is a pressure on the Ethiopian government to pay for port services. Port services have become very, very expensive. And given the economic situation in the country, it's stressful on the leadership to pay. As you might know, Djibouti has invested a lot in the port, and port services have become a little bit expensive. I was in Djibouti as Ethiopia's diplomat in 2001. The prices have gone like over the roof. It has doubled, quadrupled, probably more than that. So it's stressful. So a leader would suggest that kind of thing. That was why I earlier said, I think in the Horn of Africa, if countries and peoples do not put themselves in the boots of the other and try to understand why they are putting that agenda on the table, it will always be difficult to create a mechanism for cooperation. I'm not a decision maker in Somaliland, so I can't decide, but I can comment. Somaliland is in a very better position to make a deal because Somaliland has to strategically develop its economy. Once Mogadishu resolves its problems, the economic capacity that you find in Mogadishu is huge. It's extremely huge, I will be honest with you. So it is good to strategically think, okay, what is the best way that Ethiopia can be tapped into the resource of Somaliland that could generate billions of dollars and make Somaliland economically independent. It is not going to be challenged by economic powers from elsewhere. Look, Dubai has invested in the port. The port is there. Who have asked, have you ever asked why Ethiopia is not using the port? You see, why? What are the bottlenecks? Can Ethiopians export livestock through Somaliland ports? Why? There are a number of Somalilanders who have Ethiopian passports who will be coming up with, I'm Ethiopian, I will not pay tax. Move. You know, there are a number of complex issues that one has to understand, really to get to know on developments. On regional institutions, IGAD was created as an intergovernmental authority on fighting desertification and drought in 1986. It was revitalized in 1996 to be GAD, what was 1D, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, and has 3 priority areas: food security, peace and security matters, and infrastructure development. All infrastructure developments that were thought to be a regional infrastructure were assuming that the West is going to pay for it. So those priority areas shrank. Peace and security, much more on Somalia and Sudan, South Sudan problems. More or less, IGAD was much more successful in that regard. And environmental issues related to food security, it continues. So the institutions that we have created have not been developed to have rules that govern interstate relations. Still, the relationship between countries has a lot of fault lines. IGAD is operating on the basis of those priority areas, but only successful on one. The infrastructure is gone. But because IGAD also doesn't develop rules, for example, on infrastructure, interconnectivity, there are differences between countries on access road, transportation. Kenya drives differently than Ethiopia. There are no rules that harmonize this. I think if you want to revitalize IGAD, you cannot continue with the existing institutional setups. You have to revitalize the rules governing the behavior of states and agree on a framework. Look at the East African community, why it is working. Because there are rules on citizenship movements, rules on goods and services movement, rules on payment systems, etc., etc. Unless you create those institutional setups, it's very, very difficult to actually revitalize IGAD, to do something that you have not created the infrastructure for. That is the biggest. How would Somaliland could deal with? I think I earlier said one is people-to-people relationship. Somaliland has to know the region, what is going on in Ethiopia. Because people listen to the BBC doesn't mean that you know everything. They have to really engage, go there, talk to them. Academic institutions have to engage. I think ADB is doing a good job now, APD. But it should create a framework for cooperation with think tanks in Ethiopia, think tanks in Kenya, elsewhere. The other one is force Somalia to sit with you and sort it out. You see, sorting out the relationship with Somalia is the key. Look, otherwise, Djibouti would always be concerned to be blamed for dividing Somalis. Ethiopia, because of the historical baggage, will have its own problems. Kenya will be using politics of Somalia for its own local politics, not beyond that. So I think Somaliland has to think differently and strategically on how to position itself properly. On the Taiwan issue, the last comment, probably now the Chinese will consider Somaliland differently. You can start engaging with the Chinese better. You have some leverage.
And hello.
Should we use this one?
The issue of BRICS to be the last question, and the roundtable will be concluded by one recommendation, and then I will conclude.
Before I comment on that Brexit, Brexit. Excuse me. Thanks, Samuel, for the question that regards to Taiwan. I don't think Somaliland ever had really a foreign policy the last 32 years that's really brought some fruit to the table so far. And that's why Somaliland's government, for example, have to really rethink deeply into what we can actually bring to the table that will impact the foreign policy of the region, right? Of course, we are a sovereign country. Okay, that's what we are. In terms of Taiwan, we had a long relationship with the West, culturally, right, historically and such. And that's why probably we tend to be towards the democracy side of things, towards Taiwan, Taiwan versus Chinese. I think it's time that we really rebalance things, in a good way, where we have to ask ourselves, what are we gaining out of these relationships? Who is actually bringing economics to our table? Who is actually, reducing employment? Is it the West or is it the Chinese, right? And that's why I'm in an agreement. Somaliland really needs to, just attach. It doesn't need to attach itself to somebody else that doesn't really bring anything to the table. And Taiwanese, we are grateful to them, right? Our foreign policy, as I said, needs also to be thoughtful instead of just being reactive, right? We react, quite often, but we need to strategically driven and have conversations with our EU partners, right? Have a conversation with the United States and say, hey, we know that you want to come and build a military base here, okay? There has been a lot of think tanks that have been recommending that in order to counter the Chinese in this region. What are you going to bring to the table, right? The submersibles that they just approved a couple of months ago that will be in the region in order to protect Australia, for example. That's also an important one for us. How can we negotiate those? Those terms really need a solid foreign policy that needs to be put by the Somaliland government. Go ahead.
I'll use this one rather than turning that on. Okay, coming in on the BRICS question, and if I understood correctly, the question was whether that's going to lead to a better alignment or stronger alignment of policies of both regional powers and international actors here in the Horn of Africa. I'd be a little modest in terms of my expectations towards that. So the BRICS is an incredibly heterogeneous bunch. Already right now, there's a lot of diversity in terms of their foreign policies. Looking towards India and China, for instance, they're very heterogeneous in terms of structure, economic structure first and foremost. Some of them being oil exporters, some of them running, current account surpluses, financially quite stable, others not so much, and so on and so forth. You could basically go through all these factors, and you would see that the BRICS already, as they are quite heterogeneous. And then with the new members being added from the 1st of January next year, this is even going to increase. At the same time, the BRICS as a format or an organization or whatever you want to call it is also quite weakly institutionalized. You basically have annual summits, you have ministerials, and you have a lot of track 2 formats below that, which of course is good. It coordinates and it creates a platform for exchange. But in it of itself, it is not. It's weak. I think, has a weak coordinative capacity and an even weaker policymaking capacity. And then you have some of the bodies, especially the New Development Bank, which of course could make a certain change in terms of instruments or institutions through which, for instance, assistance, investment, aid money is being channeled. Yes, but still also there, if you compare it to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, in terms of volume, of course, it's still quite limited. And so if you look at the regional players that we're talking about here now that are being added, you can say the same for them. You have Ethiopia, you have Egypt, that are economically very, very different from the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, as all of them energy exporters. You have regional rivals with Egypt and Ethiopia, and then Saudi and Iran being added to it. So I think that's going to add to the complexity. And with the BRICS, at the level that their member states are regarding them, which is always that with the trickier questions of sovereignty, it's going to always be national interest trumping a somewhat common BRICS policy. You've seen that regarding the discussions around the common reserve currency, for instance, where none of the current BRICS members, at least, were willing to give up their national sovereignty. I think this is going to also play out in the future. At the same time, I wouldn't negate it entirely. I think the move has been, maybe it's not a game changer, but still it's a mosaic and a larger picture of strategic realignment. Again, I can probably best assess the intentions coming from the Gulf, and there I would definitely see this as part and parcel of a larger foreign policy diversification, and therefore, of course, it's going to push that agenda forward. It's not going to be entirely influenced by the enlargement of BRICS, but rather I think the enlargement of BRICS is another stepping stone, so to say, of Saudis and the UAE's intention of diversifying their foreign policy and also sort of positioning themselves, of course not completely going out of a US orbit, but still as sort of an intersection between different global powers. Again, as the states of the Horn of Africa, of course, are calculating, the same goes for the Gulf states, trying to play off international powers against each other and trying to see where there's the biggest profit for them in that. So I think it's part and parcel of that strategy, but it's not going to be a game changer.
I mean, if there was a one way to conclude this session was that in an era of multi-world order, there is a continuous disorder in each region, in sub-region, when it comes to the Horn of Africa and Asia. And this is something to do with the dynamics, and because the Cold War era, from when unipolar of the United States was leading to the international purchasing power and the rise of China, or rise of other parties. So there is a huge takeaways from this session, which one is that the integrating Horn of Africa countries to establish more understanding, and which APD and other think tanks and region can work on researching on what is going on within these kind of countries and how which are the guidelines of the create and the scope out. When it comes to the other countries, we have to also understand who are dealing with. We have to understand that there is a core values where the Western countries have, which is the democracy on one hand, and the Gulf of countries do not care about sometimes democracy, but they care about the security issue because of the Arab Spring also poses a threat to the stability of Gulf countries in one hand. So sometimes we have to understand the two-level game when it comes to the dealing with the domestic issue and dealing with the international affairs. And really this is something to do with the scholars in the Horn of Africa. I see Rashid here to always advocating we have to put those who are in field in each sector of the society. When it comes to diplomacy, we have to put our best practices, our best practitioner. We have to put, when it comes to the intelligence and security, put those who's experts. And when you put the expert in the table, then it will minimize the risk and will maximize the benefit. Thank you very much for your presentation, of the panelists. Please give a time to the panelists. In the afternoon, 4 p.m., the APD will reopen again, and we have a session on cultural, what we call cultural music, and we will listen to it And thank you very much for being here with us in Addis, Somalia.